Hi, everybody. I'm Ian Torrance. I'm going to be talking about invasive plants with you all. Wish I could be doing it in person, but it's not to be this time. Let me start by presenting my PowerPoint here. I'm going to share my screen with you all and get this up and running. Cool. Well, welcome to the Flagstaff Conservation Land's invasive plant discussion. I'm Ian Torrance. This is my second year as a Flagstaff Open Space Steward. Psyched to be part of the program again this year. Right now I'm the National Restoration Specialist for the American Conservation Experience here in Flagstaff. And I have a 10-year history with the National Park Service doing mostly invasive plant work in Lake Mead, in Arches National Park, in Canyonlands, Shenandoah National Park back east. So I've been dealing with invasive plants for a large part of my life, kind of a passion. Just starting out with a photo of McMillan Mesa in January. This is Quill, one of 4 dogs that I have. January is not the best time to look for weeds or to treat weeds. We'll talk about that a little later. But let's get into this presentation. Let's start with common name versus Latin name. I'll be using both common name and Latin name in this presentation. You'll see both of these on these slides. And it's important to know that every plant has a common name and a Latin name. Depends on where you stand on this, but a lot of plants can have many common names, and things can get confusing. So if you want definitive descriptors of calling a plant, it's best to use the Latin name, but not everyone knows the Latin names. I don't. Common names, I usually use common names. So, but as an example, let's talk about the American lion, or the cougar, or the panther, or the puma, or the catamount, or the mountain screamer, or the ghost cat. The puma has over 40 common names if you look through history, but it has one Latin name, Puma concolor. So that's just an example. The plants we're talking about today are pretty straightforward, I think, for the most part, but you should know that. And you should also know what a native plant is. It's a plant that's been here for hundreds of thousands of years. Basically, it's been in its place before, or it's been in here before European habitation. It's part of a balanced system. A non-native plant is a plant that's been introduced with human help where it wasn't found before. And an invasive plant is a non-native plant that spreads quickly, rapidly, disrupting ecosystems, causing negative economic impacts and negative human health effects. A naturalized plant is a non-native plant that no longer needs human assistance to proliferate. So let's use ponderosa pine as our native plant example, and salt cedar or tamarisk as our non-native plant. So ponderosa's been here, was here before European habitation. It's a native plant. Salt cedar, however, was introduced with the help of humans. It's a non-native plant, but it also spreads rapidly, causing negative impact to the economy and wildlife and human health. So it's also an invasive plant. Salt cedar is also a naturalized plant. So it's a non-native plant that no longer needs the help of humans to proliferate. Salt cedar is also an exotic plant, a non-native plant to the continent where it's found. But you can have exotic plants and non-native plants that aren't invasive plants. And then a weed is a term that we use for any plant, whether it be native or non-native, that's growing where it shouldn't. So in essence, ponderosa pine can be a weed. So we're doing all that thinning up in the dry hills, up on the peaks to prevent fire. The ponderosa that we're thinning are essentially weeds. And then the term noxious weed is a legal term. Every state in the union has a noxious weed list, and that is a list of weeds that are legally termed noxious because they cause harm to the economy or to human health and the environment. And salt cedar is a state noxious weed in most of the states in the West, like Washington, Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, Arizona, Utah, California. Salt cedar or tamarisk can be found on their noxious weed lists. So what makes a plant invasive? Well, there's four big characteristics that make a plant invasive. They become established after disruptive events. For example, here's tansy ragwort. Here's a photo of tansy ragwort after a fire in Glacier National Park. So this is Montana, but this is an invasive weed in the Northwest that is poisonous, toxic to animals, poisonous to humans, and as you can see, takes over the landscape after fire. Invasive plants also tolerate a variety of habitat conditions. Here's a picture of kudzu. If you're familiar, if you're from back east or the southeast particularly, kudzu is the weed that ate the east. And here it is in frozen and frost, snow, very cold conditions don't affect it. So it's able to handle cold and keep moving on forward, keep going to seed, keep growing. So invasive plants also grow and reproduce rapidly. Using Japanese knotweed as an example here. This is also another East Coast, predominantly East Coast invasive plant. It grows quickly. 10 centimeters to 8 inches a day, depending on where it's growing. If it's growing along a stream or a river, yeah, you can see it. Actually, if you just sat and watched, you might be able to actually see it growing. And invasive plants outcompete other plant species for resources. So my example here is one a little closer to home. This is the globe chamomile or stinknut. This is a newer invasive plant and can be found in the Phoenix Valley and in Tucson Valley. It's relatively new, but as you can see, it takes over the landscape quickly. And it's interesting that this photo here, the one on the left, the only place it isn't growing besides where the, it looks like creosote bush is growing, those two bushes there, is in the lower left corner. That's all Brassica tournefortii or Sahara mustard. That's another invasive species. So it's invasive species versus invasive species in this photo, and they're both outcompeting one another. So in essence, weeds are pretty awesome plants. And this is a real photo from the ACE office here in Flagstaff. We were having problems with our PowerPoint projector, so we had to get in and look at the outlet. And as you can see, it was stuffed full of, I don't know if this is field bindweed or some sort of morning glory, but we opened that up and this just popped out, popped out of the wall. So why are open space stewards talking about invasive plants? Well, it is one of our jobs, as you can see down here in the left, that we pull weeds, we treat weeds. This is one of our duties. This is McMillan Mesa. There are weeds in our open spaces. This is Scotch thistle growing on McMillan Mesa. So it's one of our chores to kind of watch for and treat weeds, invasive plants. This is a lengthy slide, but bear with me. It's important to understand why invasive plants are no good. And there's 6 or 7 points here I'm just going to mention. So they displace desirable habitat and plant life and animal species. They lower biodiversity. They alter ecological processes. They lower water tables. They increase erosion. They decrease wildlife forage. And if you're in the crop industry, they also can destroy crop yields or render them useless. They promote wildfire, like cheatgrass and salt cedar are 2 biggies here in the West. Cheatgrass fuels upland fires, and salt cedar fuels riparian or river system fires, make these fires burn hotter and faster than they would without the weeds. They adversely impact recreation. If you've ever gotten a goat head in your bike tire, you know what I'm talking about. Outside of LA in the Angeles National Forest, they have this weed called poodle dogbush. If you've ever hiked or run through that, you know what I'm talking about. Leaves a huge, painful rash, and you'll have it for the rest of the day. Similarly, yellow star thistle is the same way. Spines, this is a plant I'll hone in on a little later in the presentation, but spiny, it hurts. And if you don't have long pants, and depending on what the long pants are made of, they just prick you to death. They also can negatively affect human health. They can be poisonous. We'll talk about some poisonous plants today, and they can cause allergies. And, you know, if you have weeds growing on your property, no one wants to inherit that. So it diminishes land value. So on the Flagstaff, go back to the Flagstaff open spaces, you know, Flagstaff, if you already haven't noticed, is growing in popularity. Houses are going up, roads are being built. McMillan open space is probably the open space that's most affected by growth. There's a new veterans home going up, and there's a lot of new housing going up. So a lot of disturbance, ground disturbance. These are perfect vectors for invasive plants to get established. Once you rip up the topsoil, you're basically creating a garden for these plants. Wildfire, another disturbance. This is a Schultz fire from 2010. This fire burned hot and was devastating. It left hundreds of thousands of acres bare and ripe for invasive plant invasion. Here's the museum fire post picture with, you can see the erosion happening here, this disturbance. This is a perfect garden for invasive plants. Up on Observatory Mesa, off-road vehicle use, off-road trail use, people shortcutting trails, all these are disturbances that open up perfect opportunity for invasive plants to establish and to spread. Here's the Rio de Flag on the south side of town after flooding. Perfect opportunity for plants to establish. We have floods, we have fires, we have off-road vehicle use on all of our open spaces. And this is a biggie too, climate change, whether you believe it or not. The warming and drying of the Southwest is weakening native plants and just strengthening the push of invasive plant spread. So let's talk about our worst offenders, those invasive plants we need to be on the lookout for. I'll give you a top 10 list, a be on the lookout list, and then just a list of all the myriad of others that are out there. There's quite a few. Here are some of our weed warriors in Picture Canyon looking for Scotch thistle, and that's weed number 1. Scotch thistle is a biennial weed for the most part. And what that means is it takes 2 years, biennial, 2 years to do its thing, to grow and to reproduce before it dies. This is what it looks like. The first year, it creates a rosette. So it comes out of the ground and it creates this leafy mass or mat. And that's what it's doing here, is it's building up carbohydrate stores in the root mass so that it can, in year number 2, create what you see on the right, is that big, it'll bolt up that stalk and it'll put out all its seed heads and then disperse its seed. So that's its reproductive cycle. These rosettes, you really want to get it when it's in the rosette form. It's a lot easier to treat that way. If you've ever had to handle a large Scotch thistle, when it's already leafed out and bolted and got seed heads, it's something. It's a mess. It's really hard and it hurts. It's prickly, goes right through your shirt. It's just a lot more work. So the big characteristic, besides it being a huge thistle, is its winged stem. So if you look closely here, it's got these wing stems. All of its stems have these wings all up and down the stem. So here's Scotch thistle at Picture Canyon, just to prove to you that it's there and it exists. This is actually just off the property, but it abuts the Picture Canyon property. You can kind of see the fence line there, all that stuff under the power line and under that tree. This is all Scotch thistle here. Pretty intimidating. Another thistle, this is bull thistle. Again, it's a biennial, so it'll put out this rosette and then bolt here in year number 2. Again, huge, massive thistle, spiny, hard to deal with. It's best to dig it out when it's in the rosette stage, so you don't have to deal with all this biomass afterwards. Plus, you always want to treat weeds before they go to seed and go to flower, so you're not dealing with their progeny the next year. Here's a weed warrior taking out a bull thistle along the Rio de Flag in Picture Canyon. Here's thistle, invasive thistle number 3. This is this is musk thistle, or more aptly called nodding thistle. So this thistle puts up this big stalk and it has a big seed head on the top, and it's usually 1 or 2 seeds, flower heads on the top, and because of the weight of that seed head and flower head, it droops and it looks like it's nodding or going to sleep. So that's the telltale sign for musk thistle. Again, it has a rosette in year 1, and then year 2 it can bolt and flower. Sometimes it can do both of this in the same year, depending on resources available to it. But all is not lost. There are a lot of native thistles, and we just need to know that, because if we're out doing weed work, we don't necessarily pull all thistles. We only want to pull the invasive ones. And our native thistles are very important for pollinators, like this hummingbird, like the bees, like the bats. There's a lot of pollinators out there that depend on thistles, native thistles, to survive. Here's some resources. I encourage you guys to take a look at this, these links, and I'm sure this will be shared with you guys. So don't panic. You don't have to memorize these. We'll get this to you so you can look at this stuff. Examples of, or the 3 native thistles that you're going to run into here in northern Arizona are the New Mexico thistle, the Arizona thistle, and the Wheeler's thistle. And as you can see, versus the other 3 invasive thistles we were looking at, these are more slender. They're not as leafy. They're less obtrusive, if you will. And also another way you can tell that it's a native thistle is look at the stem. You can actually touch the stem and not get pricked. The stems are smooth, not spiny. It's usually just the leaves that are spiny, and even the leaves are much smaller. Spines are softer. The rosettes of the native thistles, much less intrusive, thinner, slender. So that's the difference. And know that there's native thistles and there's non-native thistles. They're invasive thistles. If you go to Buffalo Park in the summer, all of those thistles are native thistles that are growing along the pathway there and in the fields of Buffalo Park. I haven't yet seen an invasive thistle at Buffalo Park. So let's move on to more invasive plants. We've got diffuse snapweed, pretty ubiquitous in Flagstaff. It's an annual or biennial or short-lived perennial. It just depends on the resources it has available. So it can rosette and flower in 1 year, or it can rosette and flower in 2 years, or it can rosette and flower and then flower again for another year or 2. So it just depends on how much moisture and how good the soil is. Weeds also take advantage of good situations. So yeah, so there's the rosette there. It's pretty slender leaves. They're finely divided. There's a patch in the right-hand photo, upper right. Typical patch. You'll see this in Flagstaff in kind of vacant lots, especially over on the east side. You can see this also on McMillan Mesa around new roads or buildings that they've been excavating. It's getting pretty bad on McMillan Mesa. White flowers usually, sometimes can be rose colored as well. But like the thistles, diffuse snapweed can be hand pulled. Just make sure you get most of the root when you do. Dalmatian toadflax, this is our first perennial. So this plant lives many, many years. You can see in this photo, it's the easiest one to identify. People can't miss this with the snapdragon yellow flowers. You can see last year's growth there, the kind of the chaff on the right side of this photo right here. This is last year's growth or 2 years ago. It's previous year's growth, and now this is the new growth. So it continues to regrow from the same root mass. It's also a rhizomatous plant, so it has a pretty hardy root stem. You can pull it, and what that does is just prevents it from going to seed that year, but chances are it might rebolt in the same year, and it definitely will rebolt the next year. So you really haven't killed the plant. It's hard to get all of its root mass. Yellow star thistle is a winter annual. It'll bolt from this rosette and turn into this yellow flowered spiny mess. The spines underneath the flower heads are very painful. Makes it difficult to pull, but you can hand pull this. There is some confusion in the rosette, whether the rosette, how do you tell the difference between the yellow star thistle rosette and a dandelion rosette? Here's a picture of both. A dandelion looks more lettuce-like Their leaves are fuller, more intact. The yellow star thistle leaves are finer, more pronounced. So there's a difference there. With practice, you become really good at identifying the rosettes. Poison hemlock. This plant likes riparian systems, so areas where water collects or water runs. It grows along the waterways, especially along the Rio de Flag. Some places in Schultz Creek, actually, down lower, once Schultz Creek kind of gets close to the Rio de Flag in town, you can find poison hemlock, and there's a lot of poison hemlock in Picture Canyon. This is a poisonous plant. Do not make a salad with it. The flowers are umbel shaped, so it's like a inverse umbrella. They're white, very distinctive there. You can tell what's going on here. And the leaves are, if you don't have the flowers to identify it with, the leaves are pretty telltale. They're fern-like or carrot-like looking leaves. Horehound is another invasive that does really well. It's a perennial as well. It's from the mint family. This plant, you can pick if you aren't sure, it grows like a mint, looks like a mint, and you can crush these leaves and it smells like a mint. Russian olive, it's a tree that is very invasive, especially in riparian systems, but it's also growing on McMillan Mesa, oddly enough, kind of throughout the meadows up there. It's interesting. The birds do like it. Birds do eat the olives, but they'll also carry the olives around and drop the seeds in all sorts of places. That's how it spreads best. The thorns on Russian olive are nasty and making it a hard weed to treat. Definitely need herbicide. If you cut this tree down, it resprouts, so you have to treat it with herbicide or dig it up from the root ball. Here's an example of one of our crew leads taking care of a Russian olive on the Little Colorado River. Really not a pretty tree unless you groom it, I guess. But again, you gotta cut it and you gotta treat that stump with herbicide. Mullein, people refer to this as the toilet paper plant. You can use the leaves to wipe yourself if you're out in the woods and you forgot your toilet paper. But big fuzzy leaves. But this invasive plant can get really weedy, and you can tell if you get a big field of it, the leaf litter creates a mulch that prevents native plants from germinating. Mullein does really well after disturbance like fire. So here's some weeds to be on the lookout for. We touched on goat head or puncture vine before. Really hurts like the dickens if you step on one of those seed heads, or if you ride over it on a bike, it'll give you a flat tire. Just will ruin your day recreational wise. It's a prostate plant. It grows on the ground. It's like a vine that reaches out across the ground. So it doesn't grow up like a lot of the plants we've been talking about. It grows along the ground. Leafy spurge. This plant is in Flagstaff in certain places. And some people actually have it planted in their yards as kind of an ornamental. But this is an invasive plant, and leafy spurge is really bad in the Northwest, Midwest. So hoary cress or short white top and tall white top. So here's where that common name, Latin name, becomes a little bit more important. People just call these plants white top, but they're completely different. Lepidium latifolium is tall white top. Hoary cress or short white top is Lepidium draba. So they're two different looking plants. Hoary cress grows short to the ground. It's more stubbly. And white top is much taller, can grow up to 4 feet, 5 feet tall, depending on, again, on the resources it has available. And I've seen tall white top, it grows over by the Huntington, where Huntington crosses the railroad tracks off of 66, where the Starbucks is. There's some abandoned industrial sites over there that tall white top is growing. I've seen the prairie dog colonies over there digging in and around those plants. Camel thorn, probably not in Flagstaff yet, but if climate change has its way, plants that normally are in warmer, drier sites, like camel thorn, which likes the Little Colorado River and the Navajo res, could easily develop a taste for Flagstaff if we continue to get warmer and drier. The environmental conditions will help this plant get a foothold. This is camel thorn is part of the pea family. The flowers and the seed heads look like peas, but this is no agricultural pea. This is not something you want to grow in your yard. Very spiny. Taproot, or the rhizomatous roots, can grow 7 feet deep and up to 25 feet horizontally across just underneath the soil surface, and put up new greenery from a spreading root system. Really hard to get rid of. Hand pulling is no good. Mowing is no good. Those just proliferate the weed, kind of make it angry and make it grow faster and more robust. Basically, and unfortunately, the only way to treat this guy is to treat it with some pretty nasty chemicals, which could also impact native plants in the area. So it's kind of a touch and go situation with camel thorn. Teasel. Teasel is in the Rio de Flag off of Butler, over by the Sonic, the old Rio de Flag, where it used to flow before they diverted it there, where it goes under Butler. That area has a lot of teasel in it, and I don't think it's been in the Picture Canyon yet, but Picture Canyon is just downstream from those locations, so it could get there soon. So it's just a weed we want to be on the lookout for, and we don't want to establish. Again, pretty seed head, but really invasive plant. Tamarisk, we touched on that earlier. Salt cedar. Flagstaff isn't the best ecosystem for it. The climate's not the greatest, but it does grow here. It grows in people's yards. They water it, they prune it. It also grows on the 40, on the shoulders of the 40 there at the exits of McConnell and Butler and those areas, kind of in the rock cuts of the 40. So it's here. Just good to watch for it. Make sure it doesn't get established. And the list goes on. Siberian elm, cheeseweed or Malvia, field bindweed, kochia, Russian thistle, salsify, black medic, sweet clover, fillery, halogeton, pigweed, cheatgrass, and on and on and on. These are all part of Flagstaff's invasive weed list. They're here. But the top 10, the ones I mentioned earlier, are the ones we should prioritize and take care of first. And then we also want to look out for new weeds. For example, the photo on the right is me digging up a red hot poker on McMillan Mesa. Red hot poker is a plant that's been planted as an ornamental in a lot of people's yards in Flagstaff. For some of you, that might look really familiar, but it's spread into the open space on McMillan Mesa. I'm sure no one planted it there, but this is me just getting rid of it. It doesn't belong there. So where do we look when we go out and we're collecting trash, talking to visitors, telling people to put their dogs on leashes, and we're pulling weeds? Well, these are the areas I just thought I'd help you. McMillan Mesa, anywhere along the futs or the social trails, for example, diffuse knapweed, that's where it likes to grow. New recent construction sites, diffuse knapweed, Scotch thistle, around the veterans home. It likes those plants are coming up in those disturbed areas. Roadsides, always popular for weeds. Anywhere there's been recent disturbance, the ground has been churned and a garden is made, weeds come in. On Observatory Mesa, look along the forest roads, along the trails, and anywhere the soil's been disturbed with thinning operations where they've piled log decks, for example. Those areas are where you'll most likely find weeds. On the Schultz property, this is probably our least problematic property just because it's so small. It really hasn't been disturbed for the most part, except for a couple of trails and the Y parking area. You look along those areas, that's where the weeds would be. I haven't seen anything there so far, but I really haven't been looking, but this property is probably pretty good. Our most problematic property is Picture Canyon. Because of the illegal roads, it has a water source. So the Rio Flag flows through there. There's water available. Weeds love water just like everybody else. There's a wildlife pond, there's parking lot, there's trailhead. There's a lot of disturbance. That area also has a history of disturbance. It's only recently been an open space, and before that time it was used for other things. So lots of opportunity for weed invasion there. So when we're out pulling weeds, just remember these things. Handle all plants with gloves. Don't pull any weeds with your bare hands. You can have an allergic reaction or something worse. So always use gloves. If the weed you're collecting has a seed head, let's cut it off, bag it. You can get pruners in plastic bags from the Open Space Commission. Get as much of the root mass as possible when you're pulling these Scotch thistles, these musk thistles, the diffuse knapweed. Just don't pull off the leaves and leave it. You got to get the root mass or else it'll re-sprout. Use a shovel or a hand pick, but try not to disturb too much soil. You don't want to reintroduce an opportunity for invasive plants to get established again. So you don't want to create a garden, but you also want to get rid of the weed. So do what you can to get rid of the root mass without disturbing the vicinity. Document the plant's location, take a photo, write a report that in your paperwork. Get other people to come with you. Attacking a patch of Scotch thistle is a lot easier with 3 people rather than 1 person. It goes a lot faster. Start with individual and small patches, outliers, and work towards the biggest infestation. You can't spend all day picking weeds, so prioritize by starting with the small patches and the individuals, and slowly over time work towards the biggest patch. And if at all, just pick the seed heads, right? So if it flowers or if these things are flowering, just clip the seed heads and bag them. A lot of these plants, like we said, are annual or biannual, so this is their shot. They probably won't be able to go to seed again. And then make sure your ID is good, your plant ID is good. We don't want to confuse invasive plants for native plants, especially the thistles, as I mentioned before. So if you are in doubt, don't pull it out. Let's seek confirmation, take a photo, send it to somebody, send it to me, and let's ID it and make sure we got the right thing before we kill it. Some invasive plant control projects use heavy equipment and herbicide. This was a project I was part of in Raleigh, North Carolina. We're dealing with Chinese privet. That's all that green stuff in the background of this photo. Big woody plant taking over a lot of acreage. So we needed to use some gas powered tools and some powerful herbicide. But we are using our hand tools, we're using our hands, and we're using person power. If you haven't been a part of a weed pull, I suggest you do so as soon as this COVID thing is over with. It's pretty gratifying. You can really see the results of what you've done over time. It's good, it's fun working with people. So some resources, a Northern Arizona Homeowner's Guide to Identifying and Managing Invasive Plants. This website, this Northern Arizona Invasive Plant.org website is really good. City of Flagstaff has a site as well. And then you can look at the Arizona State Noxious Weeds too, or you can just Google Arizona State Noxious Weeds and that list will come up. So here's a quick test. Can you name the weeds in this photo? There's at least 8. And I'll give you another hint. The ponderosa trees out here in the back, these are not one of the 8 weeds, so we're not considering the ponderosas a weed. So just take a second and see in your own head, can you come up with 8 or less or 1 weed? It's pretty hard. Here's our list. So we've got this, see if I can do this. Got this Scotch thistle here, right? We've got diffuse snapweed here, here, here. It's kind of all over the place. There's a lot of it. It's all out here. Here's another Scotch thistle. This is yellow sweet clover. Here, here. Not to be confused with Dalmatian toadflax. I didn't think there was any Dalmatian toadflax in this photo. Here's cheeseweed or malvia here. This is all along the urban trail, almost all through Flagstaff. It's got this light purple flower to it. This squirrel tail bottle brush grass here, all the way through here, can be considered a weed, even though it's a native plant. It can be considered a weed, right? Maybe don't want it to grow where you want it, and it can be troublesome. It can get in dogs' fur. It can get in our clothing. It can become an irritant in doing so. Down here, these here, this is prickly lettuce. So we've got prickly lettuce, which is also a weed. Cheatgrass, all this kind of red thatch throughout this area. It's cheatgrass. And then up here, these trees up yonder, there's 3 or 4 Siberian elms, which is also a weedy tree growing up here. So that's it. That's all I got. Thanks you guys for listening. And here's my contact information. Take that down. Please email me, or you can call me if you need help with weed ID. Great. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe.